Okay, so we're going to rough out some blanks for a pendant jig. Making a couple of pendant jig blanks here. One will be for a smaller set of jaws, and these ones are for the number 3 jaws on the stronghold. This will be for the number 3 jaws for the talon chuck. January 2020, first project of the year. So what I'm going to try and do now is to make a few pendants. Several years ago I'd watched a video on making pendants, and I researched a bunch of different jigs that were available, commercially available. Some of them were homemade jam chucks, some of them were double-sided tape on a sacrificial faceplate. Lots of very ingenious ways of holding the wood. But I did also watch a couple videos on making your own wooden jig. So I made my own wooden jig. It's very similar to one that was made by a UK turner, Rance. I watched his video, and I've come up with a way of making this same jig, only I do it a little bit differently than he did. At the end of the day, we end up with a very similar product here. It's a pendant with an offset hole. This is just an example of a prototype I use for just sizing things and getting ready to build it. And this is basically the jig. This particular jig hasn't been used to turn any pendants because you can tell that it's still square-sided. We'll go through the process of making the jig and how to get the off-center hole in it, and it's held together with elastic bands. So David Springett, also from the UK, gave me some pointers on making jam chucks and holding chucks for different diameters and things, and he's a great believer in making split chucks with that'll fit into a standard jaws of a chuck, just to make life simpler and doesn't cost very much. Okay, without further ado, I've made some blanks, and I cut the blanks out on the bandsaw. And I like to make my blanks to fit in the jaws that I have available. So I currently use the one-way talon. So I made some jaws, or made some blanks that'll fit in the perfect circle of the talon jaws. And I also use the stronghold. And the stronghold, I have number 3 jaws on it. So this will fit nicely in the number 3 jaws. And the main reason for using the 2 different sizes of chucks is making 2 different sizes of jaws is you may want to make different sizes of pendants. So this particular pendant would fit nicely in this big set of jaws. We can make a jig to hold it, but it will also fit nicely in the smaller talon jaws. And you can also make smaller pendants. I have made a set of pendants and a set of matching earrings out of cocobolo. They look very nice. They were given as a gift to someone, and they very much appreciated them. And the beauty of this is you use a piece of wood about 1/4 of an inch thick and about 2 inches square. So most of us have a lot of offcuts and small pieces of wood that we can make these pendants out of, and it's a great way to use up small exotics without wasting them. And you don't have to spend a lot of money on an elaborate chuck. It's been a few years since I've made any pendants. Again, when you start making things, in my case, I like to make things, different things. If I get to make the same thing over and over again, I kind of get bored with it, so I put it off to the side and maybe wait a few years and then try it again. So that's where we're at right now. It's been a year or 2 since I made some of these, and I'm going to make a few chucks so that I can make some pendants in 2020. We'll start by making the one that'll fit in the number 3 jaws. of course, this is a stronghold chuck. You can make these with of any size to fit the chucks that you have. The nice thing, or the critical thing, it isn't really critical, but it's nice to know that there's a finished diameter that you would like to have on the center line of the jig that will just fit the dovetails of your chuck, whatever chuck you have made. And the important thing is that the end thickness of the overall thickness of the jig will be about 12 millimeters. Good to go. Okay, another point I should have mentioned is that the grain should be running cross grain at the narrowest point here so that we can, when we split it, we have good strength in the remaining material. So an important consideration here is I put my tower jaws on, so I have lots of clearance. I don't know if you can see my finger through there. So I've got lots of clearance between the end of the wood and the chuck jaws. You can do this with a standard set of jaws. You just have to be really careful when you're breaking through the wood that you don't go all the way in with your tool and touch your steel jaws. That's why I like using tower jaws for this particular portion of the job. So I've got the hole roughed out. I'm going to take a box scraper and just square the edges up and bore it straight through. Okay, and because we know that this center line here is 6 millimeters in, with an overall width of 12 millimeters. I guess I could have tapered that a bit, but we'll go in 6 millimeters in here and put a mark so we know roughly where to put the micro groove. So we cut a small groove at that location. I like to use a skew because I can just put the point of the skew in here and just cut a millimeter groove in there, and that's all that's required. That should have it. And what that does is that gives a registration point for the for gripping the pendant once. So what we can do now, we've got the offset hole completed. We can now turn the chuck around back on the number 3 jaws, and it will fit in this groove. So if you only have one chuck, you'll probably end up changing jaws a few times, but I have several chucks, so I'm fortunate, I guess. I don't have to keep changing the jaws. I just have the jaws that I normally like to use, and I put them on a separate chuck. So I'm lazy, I guess. I could do it all with one chuck and several sets of jaws, but okay. So what this ends up doing is I set this up so that this thing is grabbing right in that burn line. There you go. Usually clips into place when you get it there. Now the beauty of having that burn line on there is that the edge of the jaws will register right in the burn line, and when we turn this chuck around, this wooden chuck around, it'll grab it on exactly the same spot. So it makes this chuck really consistent when you're turning it back and forth. So now we can basically waste away all of this excess wood up to the 12 millimeter mark. And the 12 millimeter mark was, yeah, right here. So this, the thickness of this wood here, we'll just part it all, we'll just take it all away. Okay, there you have it. We basically have a chuck that you can mount this way, and you can flip it around and you can mount it this way. Okay, so that'll fit either way, and it registers on the burn line, so that makes it really easy to index. Every time you put it in, it'll be in exactly the same spot. It doesn't seem to make much difference whether it's on the marking it for the #1 jaw or whatever. I think once we have it cut, we just put it in so that the jaws can grab it in the groove, and it doesn't have to be held that super tight. So yeah, we'll go to the bandsaw and we'll cut a line. When we cut this on the bandsaw, we basically make an imaginary line through the center part here and just continue it on through here. And because we have this hole is at 50 millimeters, and of course you recall we put the 1 millimeter groove on here, so as it is right now, if we took a 52 millimeter disc for the pendant, it would fit in the groove as a perfect circle. When we take a saw curve out of here, we'll lose about a little better than a 32nd of an inch of diameter, but the pendant will fit in here and hold it at perfect circle, and the 1/32 will be enough for the wood to squeeze onto the pendant and hold the pendant for turning. Okay, most important thing in here is to make sure your fingers don't get close to the blade. I like to hold it like this, and I'll just slide it straight across. Okay, so we've got cut the two pieces. We can take these on a belt sander if we want and just polish them up, or just a piece of sandpaper like this, just if you wanted to adjust them a little bit. Clean the edges up so they're smooth. And they go together like that. And we put an elastic band on either one of the grooves. Hold it together. It's in the groove all the way around. Okay, so now to make the pendants, we start with some blanks. They can just be round discs. They're a little over 2 inches in diameter. If you cut them with a hole saw, they'll have a 1/4 inch hole in them, and that's just fine because that hole will actually help center them in the stem center. That's pretty important that the round be on center. If you don't have a center hole and don't want a center hole, then the object then is to find center. You can use one of these plastic center finding jigs and use a pencil. Just put a mark across it a couple of times, and you know where the crosses intersect, that's basically center. You want to do that on both sides because you want this to be running center on the headstock, and the tailstock should also be on center so that it will keep it running straight. So I'll mark a few of these. The reason I'm using some of these without a hole in the center is that on some of my pendants I don't put an offset hole all the way through. I'll put an offset dished area, but rather than having it all the way through, I elect sometimes to put crescent shaped marks on, and that gives it a unique effect, and I'll show you how that can be done with this simple jig. Okay, so the simple matter of starting with the discs, we'll just pop them in between centers and we'll turn a few. We'll start with the one that's got a hole in it already. And the reason I like to use stem centers is the center points on them are spring loaded, so they do center the disc. but they don't put they don't take a lot of force to hold the wood in place. Where a ring drive is fine, but it may slip. And here you can see the step centers. There's about I think these are 7/8 step centers, so there'll be a few marks in at the 7/8 mark, but those will come off when we turn it into jig. Now this is bowl turning orientation on this particular disc. You can make these discs either end grain or cross grain. This one happens to be cross grain, so we have to use bowl turning techniques. And what we want to do first is to establish the diameter. And our jig is going to be about 52 millimeter diameter. It's roughly, 52 millimeters, 1 or 2 millimeters either way will be fine. The jig will allow for a little bit of adjustment. And if the pendant is too small, we can just sand a little bit off of the jig, and it'll fit fine. So as you can see, I have a fair amount of wood to come off here, probably 3/8 of an inch overall to come off. So we'll rough that down. So I like to put a pencil mark on what will be the center of the finished pendant, and with that pencil mark we'll take down both sides, but we'll always leave the pencil mark showing. And we will take each side down as far as practical, as far as we can get down to the step centers without touching, and we'll finish that shape and sand it, and then once it's in the jig, we'll be able to finish the center portion of the pendant. One point of caution is try not to make the edge of the pendant too sharp. If it's too sharp, it can cut you, and if it's too sharp, it'll be fragile. So we'll just round it over with some 180 grit. 220. A lot of folks will take these up to 600 or 800 grit, and that's fine. I won't for this demonstration. I'm just going to show you that you just polish it up a little bit to your liking, and basically that pendant is ready to go in the jig. So what I would normally do is I would turn a handful of these discs. I would have a box full of them. You can see how nice and shiny and the sanding or burnishing is. You can finish sanding them even off the lathe later. This one's got a little bit of tear out, but that's okay for the demonstration. I think it'll be fine. You'll notice the thickness of the pendant is a little bit thick here, but that's not a problem because we'll be dealing with that once we put it in the jig. I'm going to turn 1 or 2 more of these just to have some for the demonstration. Again, here's the ones that I've just put a mark on center. The difference being on these ones here, I may not want the hole to go all the way through, so when I put them in the pendant, I may not bore a hole, an offset hole. I might just put an offset arc or an offset depression. We're only limited by our imagination at this point. And this one here needs a little bit of material to come off. we go. Another disc ready for the jig. So let's go ahead and put the jig on, and we'll turn one of these pendants to finish. So I made this jig to fit my number 3 jaws for the stronghold. And the groove in there will be almost perfect circle. Perfect. Need to make sure I keep the elastics in here to keep the jig, make it easier to keep the jig in one piece. It helps to make sure the grooves are deep enough that the elastic can actually fit right in the grooves to make it a little bit easier to pop them open. So we'll put the one with the hole in it first. We just set it on top of here, set it in the groove that we made in the jig, center it in the groove, and then when we squeeze it down, that should latch in there. On this particular one, it's I made the disc a little bit too small, but that's not a problem. That's the first time I put a fitting in here. So what we do is we take the jig, and we've only taken one saw kerf off of here. So we'll just take it to a sanding block and sand down the edges a little bit, and take maybe a 32nd or a 64th of an inch off of each side, and then that'll allow the jig to close a little bit tighter on the disc. I'll do that off camera. A little bit more. There we go. We've got enough clearance now that it'll actually grab that nice and tight, and there's about 1 millimeter or 1.5 millimeters of flexibility, so when we're making the other discs, there's a fair amount of adjustment. So now we'll put the disc in, and we'll be able to put this in the jaws. And again, the burn line on the jaws makes it so that every time we put the jig back in the jaws on either side, it'll register in the same burn line, so it'll make things a lot easier, a lot more consistent when we're turning the pendants. Again, because it's the first time we're turning an actual pendant in the jig now needs to be modified slightly, so we have to make sure that we don't take material off too far out to the outside. I like to put a mark on here just so I know. But I need access to work on the actual pendant. So in order to get access to the pendant, because the groove is 6 millimeters in from the edge, we can take about 3 millimeters of material away from this outside edge that will allow us to get the bowl gouge into the pendant. So we'll go ahead and do that now. As we can see, we're just getting started on the cutting on the pendant here. Looks like a bit of the wood just kind of flaked away. Okay, so now we can see that there's the hole of the original center hole of the pendant is there. You can see we've got about a 1/4 inch of pendant here, so there's going to be a fairly, right now I've got a fairly large opening. I'm going to blend that opening down into that 1/4 inch hole, and I'll probably stay about here. Oops, no, we're going to have to go just to capture that hole. I'm going to have to make the, just to capture that hole. So now we can come in from the other side and make the same kind of a depression in there. We should be able to get to that, that center hole there. Let's it appears that the jag is it's not grabbing it tight enough, so this disc is probably a little bit too small. Try this again. Looks like we kind of miscalculated on that one, but it gives you an example of what you can do if you want to be creative. You can actually make several different shapes. On this particular side we just went in on one side, this side we went in on two different sides because the disc had slipped in the jig. We'll try this next pendant to see how it works. So now you can see that we've actually peeled away a little bit of the wood on here, which allows us access to the pendant. This particular pendant doesn't have a hole in the center, and that's by design, because what I would like to do is I'd like to first off clean off the pencil marks, establish that it's the face is clean, and then I might just take a skew or a point tool and put an arc in it, and then I'm going to loosen the chuck, turn it a little bit, and put another arc in it. So that'll mean that the arcs will be on different centers, and it might give it a neat effect. So we'll take a look and see what happens here. We have a nice smooth face on that. What we can do now is let's take a point tool and just give it a bit of a circle, a bit of a crescent. So we have one there. Now, if we loosen this off, we notice that this hole here is lined up with the part in the jig, so we can use that as kind of a reference. And we'll take this off, and we'll just rotate this about there. Again, this is just for a demonstration to show what's possible. It may not line up perfectly, it might not even look that good right now, but it's the whole object of this exercise is to show that there's a lot of flexibility on design, and you're only limited by your imagination. So we'll take the point tool again. That's kind of neat. It's got a couple of little arcs in there. So we'll turn this one over, clean up the other side. Now I've got to clean a little bit more up here with the bowl gouge. There we go. So I have a nice little pendant with a little bit of an intricate design. You could drill a hole through the center of that and have a thong or a tie strap on it. On this side here you can see that we were able to make arcs on here. We made circles on here. You could turn it 120 degrees and make more arcs on here. You're only limited by your imagination, and it's just a little thin piece of wood. And the jig, once you have the jig made, you can use it multiple times. You just cut the discs so that they'll fit, and you go from there. So there you go. Thanks a lot for watching, and there's my version of the Gary Rance inspired pendant jig. I don't make the jig exactly the same way he does. However, it's just a wooden jig that's held in my jaws, so it fits my jaws, and it's just the way I did it. May not be the right way, it may not be the best way. It just shows how I did it on the day. Thanks a lot for watching.